right, good morning. Today's scripture reading is from Esther chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. In the ESV Story Bible, that is page 333. All right. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even half of my kingdom." And then Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Hello in the name of our Lord. For those of you who don't know me, I am, or don't know where I'm at, I am the administrator at Tabernacle Community Church, just on the other side of town at this point, and spent 3 years in your community, among you, and I was trying to think about how I could encourage you this morning and just some of the distinctive things about this community that we experienced when we were here on Sundays and in Easttown community, and just reflecting on how the many different ways that we might not expect how the gospel just gets into the layers of our heart. I learned that here. And it was good reflecting on that and how that's pushed me into ministry now and what I'm doing at Tabernacle in some ways, in the way that I do ministry. So thank you for that, and I just want to encourage you in that and keep doing that. So Esther chapter 5. What do we do with Esther chapter 5? It ends with a giant pole being built to be impaled. So I think I wrestled over what to do with Esther chapter 5. I think that there's definitely a sermon in here about Haman's pride and the blinding nature of his pride, but at some point Esther and what's happening with Esther in this story caught me, and I want to share that. Esther comes alive to God. And I think we want to see Esther as, we want Esther to be safe, and we want Esther to be the hero, but I want us to see that Esther comes alive to God in this story. So let's get caught up in the story. So 5 years into the story, King Xerxes appoints a noble named Haman as his second in command. We've seen what kind of human Xerxes is, and Haman's basically the same, only more calculating in his self-focus. Because at some point, Xerxes asks that all honor, that all honor and bow to Haman. And Mordecai, who works near the king's gate, refuses to kneel, evidently because he's a Jew. Mordecai is the cousin of Esther and her adopted father. When Haman sees that Mordecai does not bow, he becomes enraged and plots in that moment not only to punish Mordecai by death, but Mordecai's entire people. Haman devised a way to kill all the Jews on a particular day, and the king gives his seal of approval, even if without full knowledge. The edict for the Jews' destruction goes out, and Mordecai goes into full-on public fasting, weeping, wailing mode. Through a messenger, Mordecai shares the edict with Esther, and he tries to get her to go to the king and beg for mercy on behalf of her people. Esther reminds Mordecai that showing up in the king's court without being called is against the law and could be her death sentence. She has no confidence in what kind of favor she has with the king at this point. She hasn't been called into the court for anything for 30 days. Mordecai responds to Esther's concerns. He says this, "Don't think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." This must have been disillusioning for Esther. She had been instructed from Mordecai to conceal her identity and go with the flow, become part of the harem, be at the bidding of King Xerxes. These compromises must have made sense to her as well, as she goes right along, and by this point, after 5 years, she has probably fully adopted her Persian role and identity. So the stakes of Mordecai's request are high. She's not only being asked to reveal her identity as a Jew, but reveal that she had been concealing her identity from the king all this time. That could have been seen as renouncing her Persian culture and position. So at the same time she'll be delivering this revelation, she'll be showing up uninvited in an extremely impulsive and unpredictable king's court and asking him to go against an official, now public edict put out by his most trusted advisor and noble. It's not looking good for Esther. She herself understands this at the end of chapter 4. "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." And then she says, "If I perish, I perish." In this moment, Esther decides to identify with her people and take action. She decides to identify with her people and take action, no matter the outcome, no matter the consequences. So we're in chapter 5. So she shows up, uninvited, in the inner court, in her Persian royal garb. So while she fully identifies with her Jewish cultural background, she has no problem appearing in Persian royal garb at this moment as a means to exploit her Persian cultural background. So by the way, the Apostle Paul did the same thing in Acts. He exploited his Roman citizenship for gospel ends when it was appropriate. So the king is facing the entrance. He sees Esther standing, decides in this moment he's pleased with her, and extends his gold scepter. She touches it, receiving his grace for allowing her to show up uninvited. The king asks, what do you want? Even up to half the kingdom. The phrase half the kingdom was, according to Andrew Schmutzer, it was just a rhetorical custom common to the Persian court and wasn't meant to be taken literally. So he's just asking in a sort of ritualistic kind of way, "Esther, what do you want?" She asks for a banquet with him and Haman, and it seems to be understood that this is not the actual request, because at the banquet, the king asks her again, "What do you want?" Esther asks the king and Haman to attend a second banquet to kind of heighten the significance of her request and reveal the pride of Haman, Schweitzer says this: this second request has piqued the curiosity of the king and stoked the pride of Haman. Esther has used court convention with wit and wisdom. Haman goes out from the banquet, drunk on wine and drunk on pride. He calls together his friends just to recount for them his own importance in the kingdom and how he alone has been invited with the king and queen to yet another exclusive banquet. Just before this, when he was leaving the court, he sees Mordecai at the gate and observes that Mordecai did not rise before him or show fear in his presence. This enrages Haman. So what does a doubly drunk and enraged Haman do? He restrained himself and went home? What? This, I think, is another one of those strange coincidences. Haman cannot restrain his heart, but God in this moment restrains his hands. God is behind Haman's self-restraint. But at home, after recounting all his wealth, children, and his place with the king, his revelry does return to his present hatred. There's one thing wrong in the kingdom, and that's Mordecai. All Haman's privileges give him no joy, knowing that he has to put up with seeing Mordecai at the king's gate. So Haman's counselors enable his pride and impulsivity, and they suggest he build a 75-foot pole to impale Mordecai in the morning. So it's decided, and a pole is built. Haman will kill Mordecai in the morning and then go to the second banquet, fully able to enjoy himself. And this, in all reality, is the end of Mordecai. He'll be murdered first thing in the morning. Mordecai is as good as dead. That's how chapter 5 ends. The impaling pole is set and the execution is set for the first thing in the morning. This could truly mark the beginning of the end for Mordecai, then maybe Esther, and then their people. This is a dark moment in the story. And so Mike will preach chapter 6. But in this darkness, let's look at Esther. Let's look and celebrate what's happening with Esther. Hopefully by chapter 5, you can see that the narrator wants us to truly see Esther. In all of her compromise and maybe not having made the best decisions, we see you, Esther. But in this moment, Esther, that Esther, dies. What do I mean by that? Esther, as a person, going with the flow and fully embracing her Persian self as fully subject to the king, died. If she had to choose any longer between a Persian identity and a Jewish identity, she would choose Jewish. She died and became alive to her Jewish identity. She identifies with her people even at risk of a likely death. She begins to act out of this identity. In being alive to her Jewish identity, she is alive to God. She is alive to the possibility of her own death and of Mordecai's death. She steps into the throne room in chapter 5, uninvited, but alive. The go with the flow, I'll do what you please, Esther, is dead. She moves forward dead to herself. If I perish, I perish. And alive to a vision of the well-being and preservation of her people. She is alive to God. Even if Esther's life doesn't result in deliverance, she trusts that deliverance will arise from another place, as Mordecai says. She will try, and perhaps God will use her. So what would motivate her to take such a bold step out from her slumber? I mean, she's not prepared for this. Daniel, in another book about exile in Babylon, was portrayed as righteous. He had all of these practices that were distinctly Jewish, and he flaunted his Jewish identity in Babylon and prayed with the window open, and he was building himself up in righteousness. Esther is not portrayed as righteous nor particularly religious. That is, until this moment, until something grabs hold of her. It's a vision of the common good of her people, and even for the common good in general, because the text says that it wasn't just the Jews who were distressed and confused in Susa when they heard the edict about the annihilation of the Jews. Everyone was. A vision for the common good placed above her self-interest. This is what gives her the motivation to move forward. In chapter 4, Esther broke with her past behavior and identification and benefits. She has already died. So facing real death in chapter 5 is something she's prepared for. Pumping with the lifeblood of God's purposes in her veins, she's alive to God, the well-being and preservation of her people, and ready to take action. Haman, on the other hand, has no vision for his people. He has no vision beyond himself. This is what pride and narcissism does. It narrows our vision for life just to us. He had a vision only of his second-in-command image. Mordecai, by not kneeling, was doing damage to his second-in-commandness. His image as someone in power and control, just like the king in chapter 1 had no vision for his people and beyond himself. Both relied on counselors to tell them exactly what they should do, and both took the advice that promoted only their own selves. So, back to Esther. Esther's coming alive to God in this darkness is something to celebrate. What God is doing in her is something to celebrate, no matter where the plot takes us. Let me say that again. No matter where the plot takes us. And so I think it's at this point we need to be careful. We need to continue seeing Esther, and we need to continue seeing the true God in this story. What do I mean? What do I mean by that? I think it's easy at this point to see and celebrate Esther's being alive to God and now feel like God is obligated to redeem her situation. That the most obvious next step is for God to deliver her. We expect, not just believe, but expect that God will do something dramatic. She's so sincere. She's demonstrating such faith. God will honor her by causing her to live and help deliver her people. But she is able to say, with the 3 boys from the Daniel story, but even if he does not deliver us, we will not bow, O king. We will not bow and serve your gods. They have confidence in what God is able to do, but they have a very realistic and prepared sense that he really may not. They believe God's purposes for Israel would move forward even if they die in the blaze and no one ever hears about it. Esther believes God will deliver her people. Esther believes God will deliver her people. Relief and deliverance may arise from another place, but she is not so sure that God will deliver her. This is her situation. Like a person with cancer nearing the end, but displaying more peace from God any of us could ever dream, Esther displays in herself the beauty of God in her actions because she doesn't know the outcome for her. She walks right into the king's court. She takes action and responsibility for her people. She's sure of God's promises to his people. She's just not sure that she'll walk out of that court alive and having made any difference. And this leads to our first major takeaway, and really our major point for this morning. God is working to deliver his people, even if he does not redeem your personal situation. God is working to deliver his people, even if he does not redeem your personal situation. So if that statement is like a t-shirt and you're trying it on, does that feel a little bit awkward? Yeah. It's maybe fitting a little awkward at this moment. Because we're God's people and we do work for him, it's very easy to confuse God's overall plans in the world with our personal safety, status, well-being, and life. God's working in deliverance of his larger purposes may not relate to your personal situation and it finding resolution, finding what you were hoping in, finding what you were looking for, in you succeeding or avoiding something. So let me be clear. We should be prepared for God to redeem. So many times God does show up in the lives of his people. Jonah is delivered from the whale. Moses and the Israelites are redeemed from the most powerful nation on earth. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are delivered from the fire. We should be prepared for God to redeem. But we should also be prepared for God not to redeem. We rarely prepare our hearts for this. We rarely let it settle in us that God may not redeem our chronic illness, that our friend may indeed get deported, that our parent will indeed die of cancer, that our small business indeed will have to close its doors. Maybe you resonate with this sentiment that we believe something dramatic is going to happen in our lives, that God will do something in our situation to prevent loss and death, that God, if he is a loving God, must do something for us. This mindset blinds us from seeing how we can serve our neighbor and have a larger vision for God's kingdom. This is buried deep in my psychology about my own life and about who I believe God is. I remember thinking this way about a job I was told that I would lose, that I really enjoyed. And yet I thought somehow I won't really lose my job and I won't really be unemployed. And so when it did happen, I was far more distraught than I needed to be. And it took me way too long to receive the new life God was trying to give me. So there is a place for mourning and grieving loss, but this was idle recovery. And God was redirecting my vocation to his larger purposes. I remember thinking this way when my grandfather was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Somehow, some way, he defeated it, even knowing it was a death sentence. So what does this matter? What does dealing with this in ourselves matter? It matters because our vision for ourselves and our own well-being and honor and image and story can be larger than our vision for the common good. For God establishing the reign of his Son on the earth to establish righteousness and justice in this place, and beauty and salvation among our family, in our workplace, at your school. It matters because however strong was Esther's belief that her personal situation would be redeemed, that her life really would not be lost, it would lessen her ability to face real consequences and step into that throne room. It would lessen her ability to sacrifice her own self. It would lessen her ability to face death. So, an illustration, again, from my own life. When I was 20, I tore my ACL in my left knee for the third time and had surgery to repair it for the third time. And during a visit with the orthopedic surgeon, he said, kind of in passing, you're going to have arthritis in 10 years. And so I'm 30 now, and so here I am. And so I remember that revelation feeling strangling, suffocating, like a kind of death. I loved moving. I loved playing sports. I loved growing in skill. I loved the competitions. On that day, a death came much earlier than expected. So I began limiting my activities to low-impact exercise and completely away from sports. That require that kind of movement, and but all throughout this 10 years, though, at the same time, I have disbelieved over the course of these years that I would actually develop arthritis in my knee. Perhaps, somehow I'd overcome it. And so I keep trying to resurrect this vision of myself being able to do what I used to do. I could be untouched by arthritis, and so I'll step into a pickup volleyball game, or I'll try to play softball at a picnic, and I'll go all out, and it bites me. And I think I've done damage to my right knee over the course of the last 10 years because of it. So the saddest part about all of this is that this mindset prevents me from receiving in joy all the ways God has given me new life in him after sports. That breaking with sports has caused me to focus on other areas God has wanted me to move into, even if I wouldn't have ever chosen it. This correlates with this break correlates with my eyes being opened to people and work that needs to be done that I might not have seen. There's a documentary on Netflix, and it's called The Dawn Wall. Colette and I watched it somewhat recently. And it's this guy who's like super into climbing, and it sort of takes over him, and his finger gets cut off. And instead of giving up, like, fingers are like super crucial to climbing, right? So, but instead of giving up, he goes deeper into climb training to what I think is sort of a point of obsession. And on the one hand, it's a beautiful story of human triumph and perseverance. But on the other hand, he clearly does not receive the new life that's set before him by letting his dream of climbing this dawn wall die. It was the moment where he could have started focusing on his family. And his obsession ends up rippling through to the next generation, where at the end of the movie, his 2-year-old son is struggling over this 3-foot boulder thing. And I think it's sort of supposed to be moving, like that's how the narrator of the documentary wants us to see it. But I was really troubled by it, by how this vision to kind of ever resurrect his climbing self is disfiguring his family. Instead of truly embracing his disfigured finger, he disfigures his family's sense of well-being and wraps them around his obsession. And maybe to a lesser extent, but isn't this how we experience life? Esther could have tried to move forward in a way that maintained her Persian identity and maintained her Jewish identity, but she would have been only willing to go so far because she would have had her Persian identity to account for. She would have had to know exactly what would cost what. Esther could have said, yes, I'm a Jew, but I got to keep that Persian queen harem thing going to keep me safe, to keep the status quo, to keep my life the way it is. And she never would have become alive to her Jewish self, a self hidden away and buried underneath the Persian upkeep. And some of us may say we are Christian, and we are, but we're trying to keep alive something we know should be dead in our lives. And in all that vigor, we don't have the time or vision or courage or life to face the darkness of our own death so that we can begin to live into God's purposes in this city, in this world. We commit to things as long as we know what it'll cost us. We'll take action for God just as long as it has no impact on our upward mobility, our health, our standing with other people. If we believe God is for us personally, we're not going to lay us down and let certain things go. And then we're of no use for the common good of our city and God's people. Redemption City Church, God is working to redeem this city. But he may not redeem every aspect of your personal situation. Being alive to God's purposes means we need to die to ourselves. Jesus talked a lot about his own death near the end. And it really unsettled his disciples. He prepared for his own death. His disciples were not preparing for it. They were always like, no, Jesus, not you. We're not going to let you go to Jerusalem. And Lord, far be it from you, Lord, to die. They believed a lot of what he said, and yet they couldn't quite believe that he, indeed, after all, would die. On a Friday, he died, shamefully executed at the hands of their enemies. On Saturday, for a full day, he was in a tomb. For the sake of his followers, God needed Jesus in a tomb for a full day on Saturday. They needed to wake up Saturday morning, go into the living room, take a seat, and let it sink in that Jesus was over there, dead in a tomb. They needed to sit with the fact that God's Son had died. That Saturday sat them down, caused them to pay closer attention, ask better questions about what God was up to if Jesus was in a tomb on this day. The disciples needed Saturday for their dreams about Israel to fully die. In their waiting and questioning and the darkness of Saturday, they broke with their own version of God's kingdom they thought would come to pass. When Jesus died, their sense of who God was died. The thing they did not want to happen and did not think would happen, happened. And it buried their version of the kingdom and opened them to God's larger kingdom vision that involved the whole world. Jesus would not be their political savior. Saturday allowed them to break with this. Saturday allowed them to break with the God they had in their minds, with their dreams for who Jesus was and would be. Jesus would not be their key to greater status in the kingdom. Saturday allowed them to break with this. Jesus might ask them to do things to risk their relationship with others. Saturday allowed them to see this. Jesus died early on to his own wealth and power and well-being and honor, and it allowed him to be alive to God's purposes for his people in his life. He could walk through life without wealth, power, well-being, or honor, and ultimately and finally die. Jesus died on Friday. His followers died on Saturday. Chapter 5 in Esther is Saturday. Chapter 5 allows us to sit and really wrestle with who God is and what he's doing as Mordecai and maybe Esther are coming to an end. Esther looked into the face of the pride and power and plotting of Haman. She looked into the face of something she never thought would happen. The imminent death of God's promised people, and that imminent death allowed her to die to her own vision for the future just going on as it would. That future didn't exist anymore. Her people were about to die. Someone had to act. She came alive to her purpose as a Jew in this moment. When our dreams die, when aspects of our personal situations don't find redemption, when evil forces in the world seem to be wrecking our story, on these Saturdays, on these times between Friday and Sunday, when we're hoping and waiting and expecting and nothing is happening, we have a chance to sit down, lean in, pay closer attention to who God is and what he's doing. It allows us to pause in a world where pause doesn't exist. And it's a gift, giving us an opportunity to break with our version and vision of ourselves that we thought up until that moment would keep moving forward into eternity. It never occurred to Esther that she would be in this situation, and yet it was a gift, an opportunity for her to come alive to her Jewish identity. It never occurred to Jesus' disciples that their Lord could die, and yet it was a gift to allow them to know God and the gospel that he really represented. We need to enter Esther's story, and we need to enter Saturday, because it's there that these things occur to us, and it's there that we can nail these things to the cross and move forward in life, alive without these things. And Mike, I know you can testify that there is life after not going to law school. And Colette, I know you can testify that there is life after the music scene. And Kevin, I know you can testify that there is life after achievement. And John, I know you can testify that there is life after certain relationships. We come alive after these Saturdays. We need to break with our version and vision of ourselves that always finds resolution in our personal situations and achieving the things we want. We need to come alive to the redemption of our city, to God's purposes here. And that may mean sacrifice, downward mobility, release of assets, breaks in relationships, all without any promise of them ever coming to be redeemed, ever gaining back those assets, ever having the same position we had before. You may not see your church's vision come to life in this lifetime, even with your sacrifices, but you in the midst of it will have been alive to God and to that vision during your lifetime, and he will have been walking beside you in it. You may not see your city transformed according to the sacrifices of time you made, but you will have been alive to God's purposes in your city and given joy by him for loving and serving others. There may be things in your life that God buries in a tomb all the way until the day of final resurrection. Are you prepared for that? God's purposes for his church and the gospel and the restoration of all things will come to pass. God may not deliver you from your personal situation. Is there something in your soul right now stirring? Is there something God is calling you to face? Calling you to become dead to so you can become alive in him? There is new life for you now in coming alive to God's larger purposes, rather than focusing all of your time and energy trying to resurrect or get God to resurrect that thing in your life. In your death, a spring of life coming from God himself is waiting to fill you and propel you into something new. What version of yourself needs to die? What is the vision of the common good? What is the vision of the common good that you've seen, that you've not taken hold of because you're gripping on to something else? God has been asking you to invest in a certain relationship, or he's been prompting you at work to be the one to say something, or exercise your creativity even though it's risky, or he's been prompting you to stop the Netflix addiction so you can focus and learn to be a better friend to someone who needs it. Or give up the necessity, not the hope, but the necessity of being well bodily to really serve. The moment is here, or maybe the moment will come soon, and you'll feel that it's someone else's responsibility to do something about X, Y, or Z in our city, or in your workplace, or wherever. Esther could have thought the same thing. Surely, someone else who has a lesser position and less to lose should do something about it. But the situation will never be perfect. The situation will often be one we didn't want in the first place. You're looking for God to redeem something in life rather than taking up your cross and following him into the redemption story, no matter the consequences. I want to bring us into a second major takeaway, much shorter. But I think it's important to say that we need to also allow those sitting next to us to die, rather than joining with them in keeping alive aspects of their personal story at all costs. And sometimes this is harder than letting ourselves die. We want to believe. We want to believe in the dreams of others. We want those close to us to be safe. We want them to find resolution in turmoil, in their jobs, in their relationships, in their bodies. But sometimes this means we enable them to live when God is calling them to die. Mordecai saw Esther in a position to do something. And he allowed her, in the dignity of her person, to make a sacrifice for her people. How do we prepare people for hard things, for sacrifices, rather than just keep telling them, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay? I think especially with our children, we all have dreams for our children. And at some point, they may reach their Saturday and give up a vision of life you both thought was best for them. But so that they can follow God into something new, you let them give it up. Something you may perceive as lesser in life, or something that puts them at risk. We see this play out in, recently saw Terrence Malick's new film, A Hidden Life. I think that illustrates it well. The main character, this Austrian guy, he resists joining the Nazi army in World War II. He's a nobody. And throughout the film, people come to him. His own lawyer, his sister-in-law, the Nazi prison handlers, his hometown priest, the bishop. They all keep coming to him, attempting to persuade him away from continuing to resist doing something. Do anything in Hitler's army. Over and again, versions of the same pleading. You think you're doing something in resisting? You think it's going to matter? You believe you're going to change the course of the war? Just say the words. Pledge allegiance to Hitler. And go home, be with your family, and continue your life, they say. He doesn't. He continues to remain in a prison camp toward execution. What would you say to him? I think with people we're close to, we want them to find a way to remain loyal to their convictions and get to go home. Sometimes being alive to God's larger purposes means that we don't get to go home. Sometimes being loyal to our convictions means that we don't get to go home. It means being alive to God's larger purposes means sometimes our life as we know it ends. So let's conclude. Esther was coming alive to God in the midst of a dark situation. It was that dark situation that offered her the moment of decision where she would choose to identify with her people, face the evil of Haman, and live as a free person, laying down her benefits and life for her people and the common good. We often live in spaces where we don't know what will happen. We often wait for something dramatic in our personal situations, and in waiting, we try to resurrect what God is giving us the opportunity to kill, so that we can come alive to his larger purposes that transcend us and our stories, that allow us to work for the common good at the expense of things we before could not live without. So I just want to close by having us stand and meditate, just read together Psalm 23, as I think this captures and allows us, before we come to the table, allows us to respond to some of the themes in the chapter. So just read along with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Thank you.